The doorbell rang at 7:15 on a cold October evening, cutting through the warm glow of Marcus Thompson's modest kitchen, where he'd been nervously adjusting place settings for his dinner date. He opened the door expecting his blind date, straightening his tie one last time. Instead, a woman stood trembling on his weathered porch, designer heels clicking against wet wood, expensive purse clutched like a lifeline. Her mascara had run in black streaks down pale cheeks. Her hands shook. "Please," Claire Mitchell whispered, glancing frantically at the black sedan idling in his narrow driveway, exhaust visible in the crisp autumn air. "My children are in there. They're scared. They're hungry." Through the amber streetlight, Marcus followed her desperate gaze to two small faces pressed against rain-streaked windows. Something primal twisted in his chest. This wasn't the casual dinner he'd planned. This was survival. But as he stepped aside to let them in, Marcus had no idea what he was truly inviting into his home. Marcus didn't hesitate. The art teacher in him had seen too many hungry children, too many families teetering on the edge of desperation. "Come in," he said, stepping back into his warm hallway. "All of you." Claire's relief was immediate and overwhelming, tears spilling fresh down her cheeks as she turned toward the car. She motioned with urgent gestures, and the sedan doors opened slowly, cautiously. A little girl emerged first, maybe 7 years old, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit against her chest. Behind her came a boy, younger by a couple years, his thumb firmly planted in his mouth despite his age. Both children moved like shadows, staying close to their mother's legs, their eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. Marcus knelt to their eye level, his voice gentle and reassuring. "Hey there. I'm Marcus. Are you guys hungry?" The little girl nodded solemnly, while her brother peeked out from behind Claire's expensive coat. "Well, I was just making dinner. How do you feel about spaghetti?" From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of footsteps on hardwood floors. Jake Thompson appeared in the hallway, 9 years old, with his father's kind brown eyes and his late mother's artistic hands. He took one look at the two younger children and immediately understood what his dad was doing. It wasn't the first time Marcus had brought home someone who needed help, though usually it was just a student who'd missed lunch or a colleague going through a rough patch. This felt different, more significant somehow. "Dad?" Jake's voice carried no complaint, only curiosity and the beginning of excitement at having other kids in the house. Marcus stood, placing one protective hand on his son's shoulder. "Jake, this is Claire and her children. They're going to have dinner with us tonight." Claire opened her mouth to protest, to say they couldn't impose on his kindness, but Marcus held up a gentle hand. "It's no trouble at all. Really." He looked down at the two small faces still pressed against their mother's side, noting the way they flinched at sudden movements. "What are your names?" The little girl whispered something barely audible, her voice hoarse as if she'd been crying for hours. Claire's voice cracked when she spoke for them, one hand smoothing down her daughter's tangled hair. "This is Sophie, and this is Tommy. Say hello to Mr. Marcus, kids." But the children remained silent, their eyes darting between Marcus and Jake with a mixture of desperate hope and learned wariness. Marcus recognized that look from his classroom, the expression worn by children who'd been disappointed too many times to trust easily. These weren't just tired kids, he realized. These were children who'd learned that safety was a luxury they couldn't afford to expect. The kitchen felt different with 5 people crowded into the space designed for 2. Marcus moved efficiently around his familiar domain, pulling out extra plates and cups, stretching the simple pasta dinner he'd planned into something that could feed a family. Claire tried to help, but her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped a glass, the sound of it rattling against the counter making Tommy jump visibly. "Please, just sit," Marcus said gently, guiding her to one of his mismatched wooden chairs. "You look exhausted." She sank down gratefully, Sophie and Tommy immediately flanking her like small bodyguards. Jake, meanwhile, had disappeared upstairs and returned with an armload of his art supplies. Without a word, he set crayons and construction paper in front of the two younger children, remembering how drawing had always helped him process difficult emotions after his mother's death. "Do you like to draw?" Jake asked Sophie, who nodded shyly. Soon the kitchen filled with the quiet scratching of crayons on paper, the gentle clink of dishes being arranged, and the soft murmur of careful conversation. Marcus watched Claire's shoulders gradually drop from their defensive hunch as she began to believe they were truly safe. Over dinner, the story emerged in careful fragments. Claire spoke in measured sentences, as if each word might be recorded and used against her later in some invisible courtroom. She was an art consultant, she explained, recently divorced with complications in the custody arrangements. Her voice grew smaller when she admitted they'd been staying at a hotel downtown, but there had been problems with her credit card that afternoon. The hotel management had asked them to leave, and they'd been driving around for hours with nowhere to go. Her voice broke entirely when she whispered that the children hadn't eaten since breakfast. Sophie and Tommy ate their spaghetti in focused silence, but Marcus noticed how they stayed constantly alert. Their eyes tracked every movement in the kitchen, every sound from the street outside. When a car door slammed somewhere in the neighborhood, both children tensed visibly, their forks pausing midway to their mouths. These weren't just hungry children, Marcus realized with growing concern. These were children who'd learned to live in a state of constant vigilance, always ready to run. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, reminding him of the wildlife documentaries he sometimes watched with Jake, the way prey animals never fully relaxed. As the evening wore on, small details began to paint a clearer picture. Claire's expensive purse and designer clothes contrasted sharply with her desperation, suggesting a recent and dramatic change in circumstances. She checked her phone obsessively, her face growing more worried with each glance at the blank screen. When Tommy accidentally knocked over his water glass, he immediately cowered as if expecting punishment, his small body going rigid with fear. Sophie, meanwhile, had started drawing what looked like a house, but she kept adding bars to all the windows, her young face serious and concentrated. By the time they'd finished eating, rain had begun pattering against the kitchen windows with increasing intensity. Marcus looked at the storm building outside, then at the exhausted family huddled around his table, and made a decision that felt both spontaneous and inevitable. "You can't go back out in this weather," he said firmly. "Stay here tonight. I've got plenty of room." Claire's immediate protests died when she saw the hope that flashed across her children's faces, the first real emotion they'd shown all evening, besides fear. Marcus spent the next hour transforming his living room into a temporary bedroom. He dragged down every spare blanket and pillow from the upstairs closets, creating a cozy nest in front of the fireplace. Jake contributed his favorite stuffed dinosaur for Tommy and a small reading lamp for Sophie, who'd shyly mentioned that she was afraid of complete darkness. Claire watched these preparations with tears streaming silently down her face, her composure finally cracking under the weight of unexpected kindness. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, but Marcus just shook his head. The next morning arrived grey and drizzling, the October storm having settled into the steady rhythm of approaching winter. Marcus woke early, as was his habit, and found Claire already awake on the living room couch. She was sitting perfectly still, staring out the window with the intense focus of someone listening for danger. Her phone lay on the coffee table beside her, its screen dark and silent. When she noticed Marcus in the doorway, she tried to smile, but the expression looked painful on her exhausted face. "I hope we didn't keep you awake," she said quietly. "The kids had some bad dreams." Over breakfast, Claire seemed different somehow. The immediate crisis had passed, but a new kind of vulnerability had taken its place. She'd slept in yesterday's clothes, and without her carefully applied makeup, she looked younger and more fragile. She kept checking her phone with increasing frequency, her face growing more troubled with each empty notification screen. "The custody hearing is scheduled for next week," she said quietly, stirring sugar into her coffee with mechanical precision. "I need to find somewhere more permanent for us to stay before then." The words hung in the air like a challenge to the temporary peace they'd found. Marcus looked across the table at Sophie and Tommy, who were giggling over Jake's silly faces and exaggerated dinosaur noises. For the first time since their arrival, they looked like normal children instead of small refugees. The transformation was remarkable and heartbreaking, highlighting just how much fear they'd been carrying. "Stay here," Marcus heard himself say, the words emerging before his rational mind could stop them. Claire's head snapped up, her coffee cup freezing halfway to her lips. "What?" Her voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever magic had produced such an impossible offer. Marcus felt Jake's surprised but approving gaze and knew he was making the right choice, even if it complicated his carefully ordered life beyond recognition. "Stay here, at least until after your hearing. It's better for the kids to have routine, consistency." He gestured toward the children, who had abandoned their breakfast to build a fort out of cereal boxes. "They're settling in. Jake likes having them around. And honestly," he paused, surprising himself with his honesty, "this house has been too quiet since my wife died. Maybe we all need each other right now." Claire's eyes filled with fresh tears, but these looked different from the desperate ones of the night before. These carried gratitude and something that might have been hope. "I can't ask you to do that," she protested weakly. "You don't even know us. We could be anyone, have any kind of problems." But even as she spoke, Marcus could see she was already imagining it, already picturing a few more days of safety for her children. "You're not asking," Marcus replied simply. "I'm offering. And as for not knowing you, well, we'll figure each other out as we go. That's what families do." The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm that surprised Marcus with its naturalness. Claire proved herself remarkably useful around the house, attacking domestic tasks with the focused energy of someone grateful to have productive ways to occupy her anxious mind. She cooked elaborate meals that made Jake's eyes light up with delight, transforming Marcus's simple bachelor kitchen into something that actually felt like a family home. She had a gift for turning basic ingredients into culinary magic, the same instinctive creativity she brought to everything she touched. More importantly, she had an uncanny ability to connect with Jake on matters of art and creativity. Marcus often came home from his teaching job to find the kitchen table covered with ambitious art projects, Claire patiently helping Jake understand perspective and color theory in ways that made complex concepts seem simple and fun. Sophie and Tommy gradually began to emerge from their shells, their constant vigilance softening into normal childhood curiosity. They started asking questions, making requests, even arguing with each other over small things like normal siblings. But there were moments when the carefully constructed normalcy cracked, revealing glimpses of whatever darkness they were hiding from. Late-night phone calls sent Claire pacing the back porch, her voice low and urgent as she spoke to lawyers or advocates or people Marcus never quite identified. She flinched whenever a car drove too slowly past the house, and she insisted on walking the children to and from school herself, never letting them out of her sight for extended periods. Marcus began to understand that Claire wasn't just dealing with a difficult divorce. She was running from something that had taught her that safety was always temporary. One evening, as they sat in the living room after dinner, Sophie drew a picture that made the entire room go quiet. It showed a house with 5 stick figures standing in front of it, all holding hands under a carefully crayoned yellow sun. She'd labeled each figure in her careful 7-year-old handwriting. Daddy Marcus, Jake, Mommy, me, Tommy. The drawing was innocent and hopeful, the work of a child who was beginning to believe in the possibility of permanent happiness. Claire stared at the picture for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions too complex for Marcus to interpret. She excused herself to the kitchen, and Marcus found her there 10 minutes later, gripping the counter with white knuckles while silent tears streamed down her face. "She thinks we're a family," Claire whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. She's never had that before. Not really. Even when David and I were married, it never felt safe like this. She's drawing pictures of a life she's never actually lived. Marcus didn't know what to say to that admission, so he simply stood beside her until the tears stopped, offering the quiet solidarity that had become their unspoken language. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while Marcus was teaching his after-school art class, helping a group of struggling students work through their frustrations with watercolor techniques. His phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, and something about the urgency made him excuse himself to the hallway to answer it. Claire's voice was barely controlled panic, words tumbling over each other in their rush to escape. "He knows where we are," she said without preamble. "David knows. He's coming here. I have to go. I have to get the kids and leave right now." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach, his mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. "Wait, slow down. What happened? How does he know?" But Claire was already moving. He could hear the frantic sounds of packing in the background, drawers slamming and zippers closing with desperate efficiency. "The school called him instead of me when Tommy fell on the playground today. Someone mixed up the emergency contacts in the system. He knows about you, about Jake, about where we've been staying. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to put you and Jake in danger." By the time Marcus made it home, abandoning his art class to a confused substitute teacher, Claire and the children were gone. The house felt hollow and wrong, too quiet after weeks of comfortable chaos. Jake wandered from room to room like a lost soul, clearly devastated by the sudden absence of his temporary siblings. "Are they coming back, Dad?" he asked. But Marcus didn't have an answer that wouldn't be a lie. On the kitchen table, Claire had left a note written in her careful script. "Thank you for giving us a family, even if only for a little while. I'll never forget your kindness. Please don't look for us. It's safer this way." But Marcus was already grabbing his keys, his mind racing through possibilities of where a desperate mother might take two frightened children. The bus station seemed most likely, being both anonymous and offering routes to anywhere in the country. He found them huddled on a bench in the waiting area, looking smaller and more vulnerable than ever, surrounded by the institutional fluorescent lighting and echoing announcements. Sophie was crying silently while Tommy clung to Jake's stuffed dinosaur, the only piece of their temporary happiness he'd been able to take with him. Claire looked up when Marcus approached, her face a mask of resignation and despair that broke his heart completely. "You shouldn't be here," she said, but her voice held no conviction, only the mechanical repetition of words she felt obligated to say. Marcus sat beside them on the uncomfortable plastic bench, ignoring the curious stares of other travelers and the growing certainty that he was about to change his life irrevocably. "And you shouldn't be running," he replied quietly. "Not anymore. Not from this." Claire shook her head, fresh tears starting despite her obvious exhaustion. "You don't understand what you're saying, Marcus. David isn't just any angry ex-husband. He's powerful, wealthy, connected in ways that matter. He has lawyers who specialize in destroying people who get in his way." Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting. "He can make you lose your job, your house, even Jake. He's done it before to people who tried to help me. I won't let him destroy your life the way he's destroyed mine." Marcus thought of his modest teacher's salary, his small house, his simple life that probably couldn't survive a legal assault from someone with unlimited resources. Then he thought of Sophie's drawing, of Tommy's first genuine smile in weeks, of the way Jake had bloomed with siblings to care for and protect. Some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds stacked against you. Maybe I can't compete with his money, Marcus said slowly, but I can compete with his love for those children. Because he doesn't love them the way you do, the way they deserve to be loved. And no judge in the world could miss that difference, no matter how expensive his lawyers are. The courthouse steps were steep and intimidating, designed to make ordinary people feel small and powerless in the face of institutional authority. Marcus held Jake's hand tightly while Claire walked between Sophie and Tommy, all of them dressed in their best clothes like armor against the battle ahead. David Harrington was already there with his entourage of expensive lawyers, a man who radiated power and control from his perfectly pressed Italian suit to his cold, calculating eyes that seemed to catalogue everyone around him as either useful or disposable. When David's gaze settled on Marcus and Jake, his expression shifted to something predatory and pleased, like a cat discovering an unexpected mouse. "So you're the one who's been harboring my wife and children," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume for the gathering crowd of reporters and court officers to hear clearly. "I hope you understand the serious legal implications of interfering with a valid custody order." His smile was sharp and confident, the expression of a man who'd never lost a fight that mattered and didn't expect to start now. But Marcus had spent the weeks since Claire's arrival doing his homework with the methodical thoroughness of a dedicated teacher. He'd documented everything, the children's fearful behavior, their reluctance to talk about their father, the careful way Claire monitored every phone call and visitor. He'd reached out to other teachers, school administrators, and family friends, building a network of people who could testify to the positive changes they'd witnessed in Sophie and Tommy. Most importantly, he'd convinced Claire to trust him enough to share the complete truth about her marriage and the real reasons she'd been running. Inside the courtroom, David's legal team presented their case with clinical precision and ruthless efficiency. Claire was portrayed as an unstable woman who'd kidnapped her own children, a manipulator who'd seduced an innocent school teacher into helping her break federal laws. They had documentation of her erratic behavior, her failure to maintain steady employment, her decision to cohabit with a man she'd known for only weeks. On paper, their arguments looked compelling and legally sound, backed by expert witnesses and psychological evaluations that painted Claire as mentally unfit for custody. Marcus watched the judge's face carefully as David himself took the stand, and he saw something that gave him the first real hope he'd felt in weeks. The man was too controlled, too perfect in his responses, his answers too rehearsed and polished. Even his grief over his missing children felt performed rather than genuine, lacking the raw edges that real parental love carried. When David spoke about wanting to protect his children from their mother's instability, his voice carried undertones of ownership rather than affection, as if Sophie and Tommy were valuable possessions rather than human beings. When Claire took the stand, her voice shook with emotion, but her words rang with unmistakable truth. She spoke about the fear that had ruled every day of her marriage, the way David had systematically used his wealth and legal connections to isolate her from friends and family who might have offered support. She described the children's nightmares, their regression in speech and behavior, the way they flinched when they heard their father's voice on the phone or saw his car in the driveway. Her testimony was devastating in its quiet honesty. Marcus felt his heart break completely as Claire described the final incident that had driven her to run with the children. David's cold threat to have her committed to a psychiatric facility if she continued to interfere with his relationship with Sophie and Tommy. The way he'd stood in their kitchen, speaking in measured tones about involuntary commitment procedures, while the children cowered upstairs, listening to every word. The courtroom was absolutely silent when she finished, the weight of her testimony settling over everyone like a suffocating blanket. Jake's testimony, when his turn came, was brief but devastatingly powerful. The 9-year-old boy spoke with startling clarity about the changes he'd witnessed in Sophie and Tommy during their time in his home. "They were scared all the time when they first came to our house," Jake said, his young voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "But then they got happy. Sophie drew pictures of our family. Tommy learned to ride my bike without training wheels. They weren't scared anymore." The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at David, whose perfectly composed mask was beginning to slip. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source that even David's expensive lawyers hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, Claire's former neighbor, had flown in from across the state to testify at her own expense. The elderly woman had lived next door to David and Claire for 3 years, and she'd kept a detailed diary of the incidents she'd witnessed with the methodical precision of a retired librarian. Late-night arguments that escalated into screaming matches. Police calls that were mysteriously cancelled before officers could arrive at the scene. Mrs. Patterson's testimony was devastating in its quiet, matter-of-fact delivery. She described seeing Claire with unexplained bruises, David's smooth explanations about clumsy accidents, and the way the children had gradually stopped playing in their own backyard. She documented dates, times, and exact conversations with the thoroughness of someone who understood that details mattered in court. Her words painted a picture of systematic psychological and emotional abuse that David's high-powered legal team couldn't dismiss, discredit, or explain away convincingly. When the judge announced his decision, the courtroom held its collective breath in anticipation. Full custody awarded to Claire Mitchell, with supervised visitation only for David Harrington, pending successful completion of anger management and parenting classes. Furthermore, David was ordered to maintain a distance of at least 500 feet from Claire and the children, with all future contact limited to court-appointed mediators. The relief on Claire's face was so intense it was almost painful to witness. Years of fear and desperation finally giving way to something that looked like freedom. Sophie and Tommy, who'd been sitting quietly through the proceedings, with the patience of children who'd learned that adult decisions determined their fate, seemed to understand that something fundamentally important had changed in their world. Tommy climbed into his mother's lap while Sophie reached instinctively for Marcus's hand, her small fingers intertwining with his larger ones in a gesture that felt both natural and profound. For the first time in months, they looked like children who believed they might actually be safe. Outside the courthouse, David made one final attempt at intimidation, approaching Marcus directly while his lawyers were distracted by reporters. His voice was low and threatening, carrying the cold fury of a man who'd just lost something he'd considered his personal property. "You think this is over?" he hissed. "You have absolutely no idea what you've gotten yourself into. I have resources, connections, ways of making life very difficult for people who cross me." His eyes were flat and reptilian, entirely lacking the warmth that should have existed in any parent discussing their children. But Marcus had faced down plenty of bullies during his years as a teacher, and David Harrington, for all his wealth and power, was ultimately just another insecure man trying to control people through fear and intimidation. "Maybe you can make my life difficult," Marcus replied with calm certainty, "but you can't make it meaningless. And that's something you'll never understand about people like Claire and me." David's face flushed with impotent rage, but his lawyers quickly intervened and guided him away before he could say anything that might violate the fresh restraining order. 6 months later, the house that had once seemed too quiet and empty now bustled with the comfortable chaos of genuine family life. Claire had found meaningful work at a local art gallery, her extensive background in art history and consultation finally becoming an asset rather than a liability in her new life. Sophie and Tommy were thriving in their new school, their teachers reporting remarkable improvements in both academic performance and social behavior. The constant vigilance had faded from their eyes, replaced by the normal confidence of children who knew they were safe and loved. Jake had adapted to his role as protective big brother with natural enthusiasm, teaching Tommy to throw a baseball with proper form and helping Sophie with her increasingly ambitious art projects. The nightmares that had plagued all three children during those first difficult weeks had gradually faded away, replaced by the deep, peaceful sleep of kids who didn't need to listen for danger in the darkness. Marcus often marveled at the transformation, remembering those first terrifying days when every unexpected sound had sent them all into defensive positions. Marcus found himself standing in his kitchen most mornings, coffee cup in hand, watching Claire orchestrate breakfast while the three children engaged in their daily negotiations over everything from cereal choices to seating arrangements. It wasn't the quiet, predictable life he'd imagined when Sarah died. Wasn't the careful solitude he'd thought he needed to heal from his loss. But it was infinitely better than anything he could have planned or hoped for, a second chance at family that felt both miraculous and completely natural. Sarah's presence was still felt throughout the house, in the paintings that hung on the walls and the perennial garden she'd planted outside the kitchen window. But now that presence felt like a blessing rather than a haunting memory, as if she'd somehow orchestrated this beautiful chaos from wherever she now resided. Marcus often caught himself imagining conversations with her, sharing the daily victories and challenges of raising 3 children instead of 1, and he could almost hear her laughter mixing with the sounds of their busy household. The legal battles weren't entirely finished, of course. David continued to file motions and appeals with the persistence of someone who'd never learned to accept defeat gracefully, though each successive attempt became more desperate and less effective than the last. His court-mandated visits with Sophie and Tommy were stilted, uncomfortable affairs that left the children more confused than comforted. Eventually, even those visits became less frequent as David's attention turned to other pursuits, other people he could attempt to control and manipulate. Claire gradually stopped jumping at every unexpected phone ring, stopped checking and rechecking the door locks before bed each night. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive during the darkest period of her life slowly gave way to something Marcus recognized as genuine peace. She began making plans that extended beyond the immediate future, talking about summer vacations and holiday traditions, allowing herself to believe that their safety might actually be permanent rather than temporary. On a warm spring evening, exactly 1 year after that cold October night when Claire had first appeared on his doorstep like a desperate angel, Marcus found himself sitting on his back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the 3 children play in the yard that had been transformed into a proper family space. Jake was patiently teaching Sophie the finer points of watercolor technique, while Tommy constructed elaborate architectural marvels in the sandbox Marcus had installed the previous summer, complete with bridges and tunnels that defied all engineering logic. Claire emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel printed with cheerful sunflowers, and settled into the comfortable wicker chair beside him that had become definitively hers over the months. They sat in the kind of comfortable silence that only came with deep familiarity, listening to the children's animated conversations mixing with the evening sounds of their quiet neighborhood. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and a lawnmower hummed steadily several houses away, but none of these sounds carried any threat or worry anymore. "Do you ever regret it?" Claire asked quietly, her eyes fixed on the children with the soft focus of complete contentment. "Opening your door that night? Letting us turn your perfectly organized life completely upside down?" Marcus considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, thinking about all the ways his existence had been transformed beyond recognition. His quiet evenings were now filled with homework assistance and bedtime story negotiations. His weekends involved soccer games and birthday parties, and the 100 small obligations that came with raising 3 children instead of 1. His heart, which had been carefully protected behind walls of grief and caution since Sarah's death, was now completely vulnerable again, invested wholly in the well-being and happiness of 3 people he'd barely known 12 months ago. His modest teacher's salary now stretched to cover school supplies and clothing and medical appointments for a family of 5. But regret? Looking at the contentment on Claire's face, listening to Jake's patient explanations about color theory, watching Sophie and Tommy argue companionably over sandbox territory, regret seemed not just impossible, but almost insulting to the miracle they'd all created together. "Ask me again when they're all teenagers and driving me crazy with curfew negotiations," Marcus said with a grin, earning a genuine laugh from Claire that sounded like music in the gathering twilight. But then he grew serious, reaching over to take her hand in his, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease that had developed between them. "No, Claire, I don't regret it. I can't regret anything that brought us all together. Anything that gave Jake siblings and gave me a family again." He paused, watching Tommy abandon his construction project to help Sophie clean her paintbrushes. "Sometimes I think Sarah somehow arranged the whole thing from wherever she is now." Claire squeezed his fingers, her touch warm and sure and completely present in the moment. In the yard, Sophie had temporarily abandoned her artistic endeavors to assist Tommy with his increasingly ambitious sand castle, while Jake supervised both projects with the patient authority of an older brother who took his responsibilities seriously. They looked like exactly what they'd become through choice and determination and love. A family. Not born, but chosen. Not perfect, but real. Not planned, but absolutely right. As the sun set behind the oak trees that Sarah had planted years before Marcus ever imagined this second chapter of his life, he felt a deep contentment settle into his bones like a physical presence. Sometimes the most important things in life came knocking on your door when you least expected them, asking for nothing more than basic human kindness and the chance to belong somewhere safe. And sometimes, if you were brave enough to open that door and generous enough to share what you had, you discovered that saving someone else's family could also save your own heart in ways you never thought possible. The evening air grew cooler, carrying the scent of Claire's herb garden and the distant promise of another peaceful night in a house that had learned to be full of love again. Marcus Thompson closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of his chosen family, knowing that every difficult moment ahead would be worth it for evenings exactly like this one, when Grace felt as tangible as the wooden porch beneath his feet, and as certain as the laughter of children who finally understood what it meant to be completely, unconditionally safe.